Welcome everyone to the October installment of the College Student Network webinar series. Um, Grateful for the folks that are able to join us today and happy to have folks review this who are doing so asynchronously. We'll talk about a couple upcoming programs that were made possible by a recent Google award, which is kind of fun. But we're piloting a short course in solar sighting, and we're doing it in Virginia this coming spring, um, late spring, early summer. It's kind of like the Maymester time frame. We're still sorting it out, designing it. We have a steering committee to help us with that. And in the fall, we'll be trialing a career assistance program for Virginia students. And if it is everything we hope and want it to be, then we'll hopefully be able to expand that more nationally after that. We have a couple upcoming events that are worth mentioning. One in New York in February with the International Partnering Forum, and then the DWEA conference, as is typical in February in Arlington, Virginia. We'll often do a site visit somewhere locally. REpS, looking way out to next fall, is REpS in Vegas again, and then ASIS in Austin, Texas, in October. These recordings are made available and posted on the Repiring Schools website, so folks can come and drop in asynchronously, which is where most of the viewings occur. And to find those, you go to Repiring Schools, and we've got a YouTube channel for that. But you can also get there via the Repiring Schools main webpage and get down to the programs. And with all that said, we'll now bring it over to Martin, who's the founder of GeoSapiens. And the best introduction will be Martin telling us about his program and what he's been doing and how it's been going for him, so that you'll know straight from the horse's mouth, and it won't be, massaged by me. And with that, Martin, I'm going to hand it off to you and give you power of the screen so you can share.
Okay.
We'll follow up Martin's presentation with questions after that.
And I'll just start a few seconds here without the images, but glad to be here, both for a couple folks that are on with us live and anyone who is seeing this afterwards. Look forward to chatting with anyone who has interest. And I will now look there. Okay, so I'm going to do a number of images. They'll move pretty quickly, though, to start by telling you about my career, starting with Potomac Overlook Regional Park, where I was the head naturalist for the Northern Virginia Regional Park. And then a approach to education we call now all careers, which means that we try to make any and all careers green, not think of green careers as a subset of the economy. And then a take on that having to do with the idea of our creativity, how we apply our creativity to this task. So again, moving quickly here, this was the Nature Center at this park in Arlington, Virginia, that I worked at for 27 years. And among the things we did, a lot of it was pretty typical Nature Center fare. So here's me many years ago leading a group of kids out in the woods, looking at a tulip poplar seed head there. But not too long into my tenure there and discussing things with our staff, we came to the conclusion that energy was the biggest kind of theme that we needed to look at nature through, because it was the biggest nexus between human systems and the larger living systems of Earth. And so here's an energy fair that we did where we invited everyone from efficiency experts to alternate vehicles to any number of other things having to do with our human systems. And we started doing energy education long ago, back in the late 80s. as a mainstay of this work at a nature center, because we felt like awareness of how energy flowed through living systems and human systems was a must. By the time I left, well, I left in 2012, but about 2009 or 10, we had converted the whole first floor of our nature center into what was called the Energarium. And so you can see a rather typical nature center diorama here with the uh, label of Energarium in the background. And what that meant is that while we were looking at very typical nature center ideas, we were combining them with physical energy concepts, photosynthesis, efficiency, any and all other such concepts. About that time or a little earlier, we started also thinking that we needed to explicitly connect environmental knowledge, what we were hopefully providing, environmental literacy, with the economy. And that means any and all job. And so, although it wasn't under the title All Careers back then, we worked with the trade school and with the public and businesses to advance this idea. And the idea was that if we desire a sustainable world, which we also set up, which is synonymous with a healthy, thriving, and beautiful world, that we really needed to connect environmental knowledge and concern. And the biggest connection point was the economy. In other words, we could do all the things we wanted to do, correct at home and be conservation oriented personally. But if the economy as a whole doesn't remarkably change, then our directions are going to remain unsustainable. So we worked with among others, Arlington Career Center, the trade school, and the building trades there were going to make a little house as a demonstration house to show their building skills. And we said, can you make that a little greenhouse and put in various and sundry efficient systems and insulation and solar on the roof? And they said, absolutely. And they did. And where it is situated on the left there is at our Park and Nature Center, where all of our nature campers had this tour of the little green house as part of their nature camp experience. And we had various solar energy sessions at the park, including solar installations, this of a very small system on a dated bench with a fan that was in our park. So then about 2005, maybe some of you have heard of this book, Last Child in the Woods came out. And it's written by a San Diego journalist, and he was observing that we all, but especially kids, were spending more time inside, and he was documenting the then already fairly well-known health and mental health effects. Well, not too long after that, he wrote another book called The Nature Principle, of which Making a Living in Life was a subchapter title. And in this, he was drawing attention to the fact that we not only need to get outside, we need to understand how living systems work and then put them to work in the economy. So it really was stating our idea of all career. So here's a short excerpt from that book that we've used a lot. Everything in the coming decades must change. We'll need new sources of energy, new types of agriculture, new urban design, new kinds of workspaces, schools, and healthcare. Whole new careers will emerge that have yet to be named. And using this and other thoughts from that book and a lot of other places and sources, we further developed this all careers idea. So I'll just give you one example. We can talk about more if you like, but all these careers must be greener. We must be creating a green economy. And a lot of people think about what, manufacturing as an environmental job? Well, here's one example. This is the now departed Ray Anderson, the CEO of Interface Carpet. And back in the 90s, he said, I used to think that my job didn't have anything to do with the environment. And then I realized that my job, as well as everyone else's job, there seems to be some feedback here. And then I realized that my job, as well as everyone else's job, impacts the environment in some way. And now advocating for sustainability has become my number one responsibility. Well, how did he do that? He worked with William McDonough Partners, who used various environmental principles. Waste equals food. That is, we got to eliminate the idea of waste. Everything has to be pre-planned to be recycled. The use of daily solar income, he puts it, renewable energy. And celebrating diversity back in the 90s for him meant using all the tools at our disposal, our local place, our local ideas, cultures, climates, soil types, everything. And the system they came up with was they were the first to implement these carpet squares that we now see everywhere. That made it so that if you messed up one part of your carpet, you wouldn't have to replace the whole thing. You just replace the square. But I guess much more significantly, they worked with chemists to come up with green chemicals, ones that were not hazardous and those that could be recycled. And so when you finish with an interface carpet, you can take it back to the company and they use it as the raw material for um, putting or making new carpet. So there's just one example. So then the last section here is this new take that I alluded to. When I lived in Arlington, I knew a gentleman named Larry Robertson who wrote this book, and the main title is A Deliberate Pause. The subtitle is Entrepreneurship and Its Moment in Human Progress. And I read the book. I thought it would be interesting. And the most interesting thing right off the bat to me was that Larry, who's from a business background, said that entrepreneurship wasn't a business concept. He just called it innate human creativity. And he did a whole lot of interviews for this book. And he said that one thing took out that everyone that he interviewed who was a very creative person in business, nonprofits, and government all said that they had taken some kind of a deliberate pause. It might have been a sabbatical or a retreat or a hike in the woods, and looked at the patterns of the world and saw where their skills and aptitudes could fit in to making the world a better place. And I think that is just a wonderful lens through which to look at our lives. And so innate human creativity, noticing patterns and needs, fitting one's skills, making the world a better place. From my standpoint, that's really meant that since I, as a biologist and so forth, and looking at the world around us, think that we did indeed come out of this planet, that innate human creativity was really the creativity of the conscious creativity of Earth. And that's why I named my first venture when I moved out here to Colorado, Entrepreneurial Earth LLC. So if we take a look at a macro level, the patterns that I see are that the Earth is a single physiological system. It's not a rock with living things running around or placed on top. The rock, the water, the air, and the organisms all form one physiological system. And so you can see this in the form of, say, marshes looking very much like intestines, where the huge surface area allows for the exchange of gases and nutrients. Or the river deltas and our capillaries, where things are laid down and picked up again. And of course, we could go much, much more into this, but the only other one I'll lift here is the most important one right now is that our atmosphere acts essentially like a cell membrane. It allows certain things in and certain things out, but at different rates. And this is what is the physiological problem with our planet right now, is that physiology is changing and enabling the temperature of our planet to rise. So then we have to ask us how our human systems fit in with this, and then you can dive back down to Earth and look at different kind of environmental principles. These are just some um, symbols for different environmental principles. And then always jump back up too. The bottom two are meant to signify that all these are interrelated. That's the Earth symbol. and that our human minds are part of the system. The bottom right symbol is actually the Roman symbol for Earth. So, this all careers idea has a vision that we can demonstrate to students, especially in high school, that it's possible to use environmental concepts in any and all careers, and then to empower these students to take this approach as they enter the work world. And we can kind of visually think of it as all of our jobs and careers are part of that physiology of the planet. So that brings me to my last slide, which is just simply that I've taken a new tack on addressing all of this. And Geosapiens literally means Earth-wise. And I want to try to connect people, planet, and purpose. And my tagline is the integration of environmental education, energy education, and job readiness. So you can see that's been a part of the whole story that I've told you here. So I will then at this point stop the share and return to some Q&A and discussion.
Martin, thank you very much for that. And folks that are on the line, please use the chat mechanism liberally so that you can ask questions and make comments, and we'll get to those as we can. But Martin, first of all, it's really nice to see a very holistic perspective, and see it as a, you know, almost like an organism, such that we all have a responsibility to not be a disease, right? To do something that is in the better good, which I think is really neat. And it's neat to see it go past what's in the better good for our community or our state or our country, and to think larger than that and say what's better for our large organism, our Gaia kind of thing. So I appreciate that very much. It's a pretty significant shift for a lot of people who haven't thought at that level, and it's such an interesting need to have balance of your own personal interests with the global interests. So how do you go about, you know, when you're, you know, is it just a bias that you put in your way of thinking, versus, oh, it has to be my sole mission, meaning, you know, is it just a little piece of every decision I make? Is this good for us versus is it good for me? And can I do something that's good for both of me and us? Like, what does that look like as you try to put on this mantle, this new way of thinking of a career and of being?
Hmm.
What's your advice on that?
Well, at one level, you can get pretty philosophical about it, and I think it's not necessarily very helpful to do that. We can talk about our role in nature and what's the meaning of life, and therefore what gives us meaning and is helpful to the planet. But I'll tell you, this all careers thing, right off the bat, is just a simple proposition that I think just needs people to think about a little bit and go, oh, yeah. And that is for those who do feel like we need to create a green economy, one that's more in uh, balance with living systems, then we often use the term environmental jobs and green jobs. And I maintain that that nomenclature puts us at a huge disadvantage right away. It implies implicitly that part of the economy is and can and should be green or environmental, and then the rest of the economy can just go on doing whatever it's doing. And that it won't work. We can't have an economy that's say 20% green and 80% not. I don't even think it would work at 90-10. That's how impactful our various and sundry efforts in our economy are. Essentially, we need to be near 100%, um, much less energy intensive, not using toxics, recycling everything and designing to make that the way right from the beginning rather than recycling after the fact, etc. And the only way we're going to get there is if we have that thought first and foremost in mind. Our entire economy has to be green.
I love that. There's a lecturer, Bill Browning. I don't know if you came across him, but he was at the Green Building Council, and he had a lecture called "The Greening of the Building and the Bottom Line." This
Mm,
notion that when you build a green building, something that is more sustainable, more efficient, lets uses more natural light as opposed to pumped in electrons, um, that it makes for a better building experience. Absenteeism goes down, productivity goes up. It's exactly what you're talking about. Is like stop
mm,
thinking about it as a green building, start thinking about it as a way to make a better building. Just
yeah.
yeah, think about it that long. So Natalie has a nice question here, and that she's appreciating this intersectionality that you described. Um, and just bringing it all together. And her question what do you think about the integration of governmental policy? Like, how do you, what does policy look like that reinforces education and influences people to think in a more holistic fashion that's less at odds with the long-term vision for our place on this in this world?
Yeah. Well, coming from the standpoint of a non-policy person, but also not ceding my responsibility there. In other words, I think we all have a responsibility to be a part of the conversation, even in areas that aren't our expertise, just by being active, observant people. I'll say that, yeah, policy has a huge impact and huge potential. Um, at one level, it is trying to work with human nature so that it gives incentives and not just penalties, gives the ability for people to work together rather than kind of pitting us against each other, et cetera. Those are real important parts of any policy that's going to take us in the right direction. Um, Myself personally, I come to the conclusion that eventually our policy and our cultural story, our cultural narrative, is going to have to be that we can't physically grow forever. So the policy of growth for growth's sake is going to have to change. Um, what does that mean, really? It just means that sometimes we're going to grow in certain areas, and sometimes we're not, and sometimes there'll be a steady state economy, et cetera, but that our success won't be defined by constant economic growth, with any part of that measure being, the consumption of energy and materials. So that's a big overarching one. And then my earlier comments went to more of the what kinds of policies are helpful.
I was at a conference last week and there was, hopefully this background noise isn't too distracting. I apologize for that. Our flight is boarding in not too long. But at a conference last week where it was about siting and siting of renewable energy. And there's a whole reference to Madison in the Federalist Papers, number 10, and this notion of don't tell me what I can or can't do on my land, as long as what I'm doing isn't harmful to health and human safety, kind of thing. Um, and yet at the same time, you know, there is an intersection of that kind of concept with the idea that how is that going to impact? It's not just human health. Like, am I ingesting poison? But how do I sort of tweak those kinds of notions so that we think more globally? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, I think of one thing as being sure to bring up arguments in um, opposition to the simplistic argument you just gave that, oh, it's my land, I can do anything I want. It's our land, we own it, but already there are umpteen things that we can do on our land. And I use sometimes the example of if you live in certain situations, most usually as you get closer to cities, you can't have septic fields anymore. You have to hook up to the sewage system, and most people do that willingly and know the value in it. And most people would also be very upset if their neighbor tried to get around it and say a septic system leaked into their property or whatever. We do these things because they're the realistic and healthy ways of doing things, at least in the ideal sense that's the case, and we should always work toward that ideal. So first off is just that we can't think too simplistically about this. We have to realize that we're already in a paradigm of balancing our personal and public responsibilities. Um, the second part of what you asked there, maybe you can remind me a little bit.
Yeah, the question was, from a policy perspective, and I think you've hit it. You've already talked about zoning, and that is a
Mhm.
policy where you're
Yeah,
saying there are certain things. The other one might be eminent domain, which doesn't feel like policy. I mean, it is policy,
yeah,
but it
yeah,
also says, there is a public good and a general good to use this piece of your land for something that maybe wasn't foreseen a long time ago, but is critical now.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, an eminent domain is an example where the idea itself is accepted and we've used it and everything, but now that it's often in the service of growth for growth's sake, as opposed to let's tease out when growth is healthy and good and needed, as opposed to growth for growth's sake, then eminent domain becomes a tool of continuing a harmful process. By the way, I see a note from MRA, is that right? In the chat here. Should I
yes,
address that one?
please do. Yeah, thank.
Um, thank you for your presentation. When do you think the global economic powers go to 100% renewable energy consumption to save Mother Earth? 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. Still, global renewable energy consumption is on the range of 30 to 35%. Um, well, I don't know, I can't speak definitively on that, but I've heard people in the renewable energy field say that even though policies in the United States, especially now, are kind of antithetical to solar, for instance, solar and wind, that they've kind of hit a critical mass where that transition is going to take place just because they're the cheapest forms. Um, so, I don't know if I had to take a guess, I would say that midpoint there, 30 years. And the reason I treat it somewhat open-endedly is because it really has to do with our overall idea of are we going to be able to address growth for growth's sake? Because if we're not, then I don't think we'll ever get to 100% renewables. And if you just take the idea of AI, for instance, where currently people are saying, oh, we're going to need twice the amount of energy that we have now, then you're quickly into a situation where you hear people talking this way. We need all forms of energy. We need the solar and the wind and the fossil fuels and nuclear and all that. And that's because even just growing in response to the supposed need for AI, we're on a track not to become 100% renewable. So there sure are a lot of variables in here, and it's going to take a really serious societal discussion to figure out which ways we're going.
Thank you, Martin. You shared a fun slide that sort of showed that there's a lot of careers that can be thought of as having a role. Do you mind putting that slide back up and then speaking to, I don't know, three or four, just to give people an idea? Because when we think about workforce development, we think about development of renewables. We're thinking, oh, there's going to be environmental, there's going to be, right, somebody doing or some sort of review, environmental review, or there's going to be engineers. That's an easy one. Technician level, bankers, lawyers, kind of thing. But you had a lot more than
Yeah,
that. Do you mind just kind of sharing a little bit of what you had in mind as you were putting those up, so that to give us a broader perspective?
sure. And actually, I'll go to that slide, but then I did include some slides that I put after the end here. Oops, here we go. That will speak to that as well by actual case study. So I think this is the slide you mentioned. And so these are just a few careers. It's mostly to show examples of careers that we don't usually think of as environmental or green careers, or at least not all of them, and how all of these plus all the others symbolically shown with all the little tiny photos in the background have to all become greener. And so let me zoom ahead here to past the end of the slides that I shared with you. They may be a little out of order. There's that one. So like one take on this is biomimicry, where Janine Benyus a couple decades back started the idea that we have to emulate nature's genius in various um, things that we do. And a lot of those are buildings and products and so forth. One famous example is how architects studied termite mounds in Africa and mimicked their self-ventilation systems. And the building you see there in the foreground is a self-cooling building that uses 90% less energy to cool itself than other buildings in that area in Africa. So that's one take on it. Then this building is already almost 30 years old, but it used to be and probably still is one of the greenest buildings in the United States, where they're not only using solar to run the whole building, but they've got an internal sewage treatment system where when you flush a toilet, it goes into a room where there's all these tanks and various sets of microorganisms and then macroorganisms clean up the water. The water goes outside to these ponds, and then they draw that back in to flush the toilets again. Um, David Orr, who was the professor then, he actually did a talk in 2015, and he lists, just all of these. He was speaking about these in this video, that all of these have to become green. And then he made a point of saying that everything we do. I'll give you one last set of examples here. If we take the environmental principle of the nitrogen cycle, now we have to see that we are actually a huge part of the nitrogen cycle through fertilizer factories and vehicles. Before World War II, we were an infinitesimal part of the nitrogen cycle. And then now we're a huge one. So what are we going to do about all the different problems we have there? Well, one is instead of using natural gas to make our fertilizer out of atmosphere, we can start to produce smaller amounts at the places where we need fertilizer done and thereby use a whole lot less energy. And then I love this one in Amsterdam, these are public urinals. And it turns out that they led the world in green roofs some decades ago, and they started harvesting urine to use as fertilizer for their green roofs long ago, and now even use them on local farms. And then the last example I'll give you here along the same lines is this business in Vermont that's called the Rich Earth Institute, and they are demonstrating and trying to change legislation to use human urine for fertilizer, especially in the eastern United States where rainfall helps dilute the salt in the urine. So anyway, there's really case study after case study after case study of different kinds of businesses and fields doing their work totally differently.
That's wonderful, and I'm really glad to see you bring up Oberlin. That's my alma mater, and I love that
Yeah,
building. Um, and it's neat when you go into the green machine room. It doesn't smell. It smells like rich and
yeah,
healthy, as opposed to like if you go to a sewage treatment plant, it smells kind of like sewage.
yeah, yeah.
So that's really really wonderful. Um, do you mind? You're probably familiar with agrivoltaics, and Jack's Solar Garden isn't all that far from you, kind of thing. Do you mind speaking a little bit to that as a nice example of kind of a holistic approach to energy?
Yeah. Yeah, agrivoltaics is starting to get the attention it deserves. What that is that where you have a, say, industrial or community scale solar installation, you have a lot of use of real estate. And the traditional way is that you have to have rows of these things with access. So you have gravel paths or roads in between. And here in Colorado, where sometimes the sun is actually too hot, too intense for good growing of, say, vegetable crops, they started experimenting with growing vegetables and other crops in the interstitial spaces, and where they'd get partial, not full, but partial shade. And also, interestingly, the runoff anytime it rains is great here because we get so little rain that it helped water those plants that were in the correct places. And it's proved to be very effective, and it adds value no matter what, right? Even if you were able to produce only some kinds of plants, it still adds value to the solar proposition. Well, now people are starting to use it in other parts of the country and the world to not only grow plants, but to have animal grazing and other uses that just add value to that spot of land that we've had to displace with solar panels.
It was fun to see folks talking about agrivoltaics in the same vein as the Conservation Reserve Program. This notion that the Conservation Reserve Program is a way to insulate farmers who were originally suffering under commodity price volatility, and that if they could put their land into fallow mode, they could do a bit of nitrogen fixing, soil restoration kind of thing. And that's exactly what solar does. And that you can put it into a conservation reserve program with pollinators, right? And restore that soil health and make revenue off the land lease for the solar project itself. Do you mind sharing a little bit about, sort of the role with manufacturing? And I mean, I love that example. I never understood the concept of a carpet tile, and that it was like it meant that you don't have to tear up the whole thing. You just take out a little piece where the blemish is or whatever. That was eye-opening. Can you share about other forms of manufacturing, whether it be thinking about cement differently or, you know, recycling construction materials, that kind of thing? Do you mind digging into that a teeny bit if you can?
Sure. And all of those, of course, and everything these days is part of this growth-based economic system. And so, first and foremost, if there's a way that we can extend the life of things, reuse them, etc., it makes it so that while we're still in that paradigm, we have to procure the least amount of new, fresh resources. So if you design a carpet to be recycled, then you're immediately cutting into the effects of that growth in demand for carpet. Eventually, I think, we just have to, again, address the underlying premise because so much of the climate change and pollution problems of the world are due to the fact that we're just never endingly um, processing, using more energy and goods. But within that context, just about anything we do can be changed in terms of how we manufacture it. William McDonough also worked with a interesting case study. It's not too different from the carpet one, but it gives you a different take on it. It was a fabric manufacturer in Switzerland, as I recall, and they were just about to be shut down or fined by their municipality because they had such toxic effluent. And so his team went and looked at all the possibilities with this business, and they said, well, the first thing is green chemistry. We just have to change the chemicals we're using for dyes and so forth. And they did that to the company's satisfaction. They had the beautiful dyes that they wanted, but not only were they not toxic, but then all the company's clippings became a resource that they could use for water filters of all things. And they sold water filters based on the clippings of their fabric so that other companies could clean up their water. And so it's really just your outlook. We always say, hey, we're smart people, we're very capable, but what are we focusing our attention on? And if we focus our attention explicitly on making everything we do, including manufacturing, ever less harmful, and as William McDonough says, ever more regenerative, ever more good, we certainly can address the issues that face us.
So I'm not an economist, but I remember learning that the benefit to an economy of growth is that you can be sloppy, right? Because you don't ever have to like you don't have to totally pay down the debt if the growth is what's paying down the debt. You don't have to be profitable necessarily by growing. It is such a fundamental tenet of our society that we can be sloppy that way. Whereas if you're trying to be sustainable, you can't be sloppy. You're not like you cut exactly as much wood as you need, you know, because the forest isn't going to restore more than what you need, kind of thing. Can you speak a little bit to like what's involved with such a fundamental shift? Like, how are we going to pull that off?
Well, I think one of the most important careers to address our environmental situation is psychology, because we certainly have needs as human beings to be fed, clothed, sheltered. And then once we reach some minimal level, everything past that becomes want. And those wants are sometimes kind of natural. We have a definite human nature acquisitiveness, but then it rapidly goes into the fulfilling the story of our society. You know, in other words, it's kind of the keeping up with the Joneses, because that's what we've been told we should do. We should have that better job, that better income, that better and bigger, often house and car, et cetera, et cetera. And there's plenty of examples. I mean, it's not the norm yet, of course, and that's the problem, but there's plenty of examples of people who suddenly go, you know what? The only reason I have this huge house is for appearances and image, and then they move into a much smaller house. Or I don't need this, truck that's using all this fuel, not only for the environment's sake, but because I'm sure to take a lot of fuel that I have to spend money on, and also upkeep, etc. Um, if we can find things that genuinely um, fulfill us and give us satisfaction, as opposed to a never-ending race to keep up with others to define that satisfaction. I think that in and of itself is such a well, ultimately it's going to have to be the place where many of us arrive. Um, as far as the economic model, though, we just don't either question it enough, and also we don't apply the thinking that is out there in fairly high amount. So there's a long-standing organization called the International Society for Ecological Economics, and they've had people all over the world working on these questions for decades. Um, you can look online and find the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, CASI, and they have all sorts of data and research on how we create a different economic model. There's a woman in UK who named it Kate Rayworth, who talks about and wrote a book about the donut economy that fulfills human needs but doesn't spoil living systems. So there's plenty of thought on this, and we need to bring this to the fore.
I love that. So in the last few minutes, it would be great to, oops, there went your camera. It'll come back. We know that. There it goes. In the last few minutes, it would be great to just kind of have a parting thought from you. Like, here's the here's 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 what you want us to take away as most important from this concept, um, so we can try to ingest it.
Yeah. Well, I think actually the most important thing for now is to take it down to the level that I'm mostly working at. I'm certainly doing sessions like this and writing and so forth, and looking at the macro level. But mostly I'm working with high schools in Boulder County, Colorado, where I live, to get across to high school students first just the concept that anything that they want to do, they have an interest in and aptitudes for, can probably, there might be some exception to this, but can probably be made much, much more sustainable in terms of energy use and materials use. And there's probably case studies out there already that they can learn from and aspire to. But the problem is we don't make this a part of our education. So we first need to show them the concept and then backfill it with the content so that we first up our level of environmental knowledge and environmental literacy, and then both show and demonstrate, and in some ways even insist that those can be connected to whatever they do. So I'm working specifically with students, both as kids that I talk to and intern, and we do public programs on the subject. And I really hope that that can be something that takes root in all communities.
Excellent. Well, Martin, we really want to express our appreciation for your coming and sharing your perspectives today. It's very valuable, and I do think it's such a critical piece of how we don't fry ourselves, and how we become more responsible. The time required to regenerate things is a lot shorter than you might expect. There's a wonderful group out of Huntington, West Virginia, the Coalfield Development Group, and they did some regenerative ag experiments, let's call that, on top of strip mine lands on top of the mountaintops of West Virginia. And they did it through intensive, they brought in a bunch of goats and they put them on a small plot and they fed them and they did that thing. And within 3 or 4 years, the mineral, it was just purely mineral, like going on a rock pile, was growing vegetables. And they were able to sell it through a business that they created with people who 4 years prior had been on the street effectively. So this can be a pretty quick turnaround if we do it right. Um, so we just have to make sure that we're engaged correctly and we have thought leaders like yourself helping to keep us on track, because it's too easy for us as humans. It's just our nature is to keep our heads down and be thinking about how am I going to get that bigger house or that bigger car, right? So that I can feel more secure in who I am, or that I'm going to have food for the winter. Um, but that we need to think bigger than that. And so your voice is really essential. Um, uh, Real quickly, as we think about the next steps, we've got another webinar coming up next week, I think. Oh, that's today. Actually, that's funny. So I won't talk about this webinar because we already talked about that. I'm not sure why that's teed up, but keep an eye out for the next webinar. That's actually in November, and we'll have a speaker from Pocket, the group there in Colorado. Actually, Martin, you'd enjoy them. It's the Ingenuity Group, and they make fun devices for for our world, and they're moving into clean power, which I think is really wonderful to see that
Mhm.
movement. But thanks again, Martin, again, very much for sharing your thoughts today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and I enjoyed it. Okay,
Cheers.
take care.
Bye.